Hi, my name is Jennifer Brandel. I am a journalist and a co-founder of the company called Harkin. And during the pandemic, I had two major things that I was consumed with. One, having a baby, as you can see here, and two, reading a lot of books. Today, I wanted to focus on one that's not designed for journalists per se, but there are so many incredible lessons for journalists and newsrooms in it. And I wanted to highlight a few of those here today. It's by journalist and author Amanda Ripley, and it's called High Conflict. So what is high conflict? It's any conflict that becomes self-perpetuating, all-consuming, in which pretty much everybody ends up worse off than they were before. And typically it becomes an us versus them conflict. So you can see a few examples of those binaries on the right in that chart. Now, conflict doesn't just start out of the blue. There are fire starters, things that accelerate and get conflict to erupt. One is group identities, like you saw in that chart. And so many news stories are focused on Republicans versus Democrats or Han Chinese versus Uyghurs, etc. That helps start fires. So does things like humiliation and corruption, which so many news stories focus on. You know, humiliation like you can see here with a Canadian MP caught naked in a Zoom call, and then corruption, which is also accountability journalism. But the one that I was super fascinated by and wanted to unpack more today is conflict entrepreneurs. Now, what is that? That's people or a person who exploit conflict for their own ends. An example here are influencers behind anti-vax. But it led me to wonder, is the journalism industry itself a conflict entrepreneur? Is our business model being a conflict entrepreneur? And what happens when we are? So, questions you can ask yourself to see if you are behaving as a conflict entrepreneur is, do you assign stories based on how much attention and engagement you believe they'll get? Do your highest performing stories have conflict at the core? Are they controversial? And the other thing that exacerbates this are platforms themselves. Are they conflict entrepreneurs? I think we can say very clearly that yes, they are. When you think about the top three that so many newsrooms use, we have Facebook, where their feed drives and privileges incendiary content, YouTube's recommendation system that leads users toward more extreme content and exacerbates conflict, and Twitter's design encourages these outrage cascades. This is by design, and it's a lethal combination when you combine the conflict entrepreneur tendencies of journalism alongside the platforms themselves. And it might be good for business in the short term. You might be, doing things based on reach in an advertising model, but it's bad for society. So what is in your power to change? If you're interested in not just adding more conflict to the world, but actually helping to serve citizens to make the most important decisions they can to help themselves, there are a few things I wanted to cover. One is to report beyond the binary. Any story in which you just have two sides, you're hearing from one side and the exact opposite, you need to do more homework. You need to bring the voices of people who are in the center, or at least not as extreme. You also need to complicate the narrative and not just have it be a simple good versus evil, us versus them. Amanda Ripley, the journalist that wrote High Conflict, also has an incredible piece around questions that you can be asking in stories to help dissolve conflict. You also need to build goodwill and trust in media. I'm an American citizen, and in the US, you can see the trust in media is so low. So how do you start to actually cover communities that are in conflict with your newsroom and don't trust you? One thing is you can consider this concept called the magic ratio. How many positive interactions you have with a community or demographic versus how many negative. Are you only going into communities and covering them when something is wrong? That's going to lead to a low trust environment. One way you can also get around low trust is to practice solutions journalism. So don't just cover what's wrong, cover what's actually working and why it's working. That helps people want to read the news more because it's not just all stories about the world ending. The other thing is just training reporters how to listen better. A concept called looping, in which they repeat back what a source says to them to make sure that they have it right, because so often we interpret things we don't even realize and get it wrong. So what happens when news accelerates conflict? It's bad for business. People avoid the news. There's a drop in consumption. It's bad for people. We get depressed, we get anxious when all there is conflicting news. It makes problems more difficult to solve, and it's bad for truth. It distorts reality at the end of the day. Not everything is terrible, and not everything is us versus them. So how can your newsroom change habits? Amanda and I are actually in collaboration thinking about how we can support newsrooms to identify how to become less conflict entrepreneurs in the way that they operate. If you're interested, reach out. You can email info@weareharken.com. Thanks so much for your time and have a peaceful day.